Welcome. This is Dwayne Deason, and I'm the host of the Cost Management Center podcast. I have a very special guest today that I'm excited about, Jim Shand, who I've actually had the opportunity to work with, and he was one of a great advisor and a representative of AlixPartners at the time, and really helped our company try to manage some cost issues that we were having at the time. Jim, welcome.
Dwayne, thank you for having me.
Jim, I always like to give the audience just a little bit about your background. Not everybody picks the cost management field, and you certainly did. Give us some information about your background and then a little bit of why you picked the field.
Sure, thanks, Dwayne. So, as you might hear from the accent, I'm originally from the UK. I came to the US in the mid-90s to do an MBA so I could get into management consulting. And that's what I did. So I went to MBA to MIT, did my MBA at Sloan. And after that, joined some really great management consulting firms. And interesting the way you introduced this, I didn't kind of pick cost management as a field to kind of go join, but it's kind of happened, based on the experiences I've had. So from A.T. Kearney, I went to a couple of firms where this really was, now I reflect on it, the topic. I was one of the early employees at a company, Infosys Consulting. It was a startup within the broader Infosys company, which I think is most known for BPO, IT outsourcing, and so on. I mean, that's all about a cost management, cost reduction, and the idea is kind of marrying management consulting with the big engine that is Infosys. And after a short stint in industry, I spent the last 11 years at a really awesome company, AlixPartners. I mean, just had some fantastic colleagues there. And they are over the last couple of decades, they've expanded their services from they were originally known for turnaround and restructuring into kind of more management consulting, strategy, growth, and so on. But I certainly focused in the last 10 years on cost management. I didn't really kind of pick that field. But the work I've done over the last 10 years has been primarily in private equity, either directly for private equity companies or for their portfolio companies. And I want to say more than 90% of my work was focused on cost management, cost reduction, all with the singular goal of improving EBITDA. So that's a little bit of my background, and hopefully we'll kind of dig into some of this.
That's fantastic. And I just want to make sure, because the audience might not be familiar with AlixPartners, but it is kind of the premier firm in financial duress situations where most people will lean to and go to if there's a circumstance where they really need someone to help control their costs and manage out of a difficult situation. Is that a fair description?
It is, absolutely. Look, they kind of got their start in kind of turnaround and restructure as the companies that were going through bankruptcy. So now, it's I think every company, I know we're going to get into this, every company can kind of better control and better manage their costs. And so, while today, they do a lot of work with distressed companies or companies that are kind of heading that direction, all of those principles, every principle can be applied to healthy companies as well. And, and I think healthy companies should be applying those principles.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. And I'm a big advocate for the same. And I think if they did so, I think a lot of them would avoid people like you and I having to come in and help them, because they were on the front end of issues rather than waiting and reacting to a difficult financial situation.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a term, right, you kind of often hear in consulting or with companies, and it's fuel for growth, right? It's not a consulting term, but the basic idea is, cost cutting is not cost cutting for cost cutting sakes, but it's creating the fuel for growth. And who doesn't want to be part of a growing company?
Yeah, I very much agree. So when you typically got involved in a engagement, because I rarely got called in when a company was in a good financial position and just wanted to do better. I think I can remember one circumstance where I got called in for something like that, which I think the company was very progressive in that way. Most of the time, there's a challenging situation going on, which they make the call to a company like yourself, just or someone like yourself, or a company like AlixPartners. Is that your experience as well? Like, what is the majority of the clients that you had? Were they under a financial duress situation? Was it usually M&A activity? Was there a typical situation?
When I say typical situation, right, it's going to be I say aggregating my kind of knowledge and experience across all my kind of management consulting career,
Yes.
kind of what stands out to me is most companies were calling us in when, well, actually, let me say this differently. I don't recall any company calling us in when they were kind of growing rapidly and wanting, and this was their top priority, right? I mean, now I think about it, maybe it should have been actually. So not necessarily companies in duress, but companies that were unhappy with their financial situation on one extreme. And certainly at the other end of the extreme, I have been involved in companies who've just come from bankruptcy as well. But all companies for whom, kind of growth and, customer acquisition and so on has suddenly not become the toppest of top priority. I guess, being really frank, a lot of companies, yes, were, themselves did know they were headed in the wrong direction, or, for with the last 10 years working in private equity, where the sponsors were not happy with with the direction they were headed. And, if there's a focus on EBITDA, it's a pretty simple measure to know if you're headed in the right direction or not.
That's interesting. And one of the things that I wonder if you have a different perspective coming from working a lot with private equity, because when you work with a company when you're put in by private equity, you have much more influence on that company than when you're not. So when a company calls you in, and this was my experience, if they were not under a mandate like the owners had called you in to do something, they generally weren't as aggressive in pursuing cost-saving strategies and efficiency strategies. But when private equity is calling the shots, essentially they're going to do whatever you recommend, because they're going to be in a tight spot. If they don't, they're going to have to answer to the private equity group that basically paid for you to come do that. Am I being accurate, or is it not quite that clean?
No, I mean, no, it is accurate. I mean, there are some nuances maybe, but if you have oversight on your company and somebody's interested in, the financial performance of the company, and you're not headed in the right direction, first of all, you're going to be looking at your own position in that company. Interesting though, in private equity, there are kind of very different models, right? At one end of the extreme, there are, private equity companies who are very kind of interactive with their portfolio, right? They very hands-on. They will put in a transformation leader into a portfolio company, or they will, strongly encourage somebody to hire, to make sure that their value creation program is happening. The other end of the extreme is, PE firms who are very good at assessing talent. So they want to make sure they got the right leadership in place, but will kind of largely leave the company alone, right? And again, if they're hitting the financial targets and of course there's maybe some input, but they'll kind of leave the company to themselves. But the results are pretty transparent, right? And if in that kind of model, if you're not hitting the results, then your position is probably at risk.
And then let's stay with the big picture for a little bit, and then we'll drill down in some more things that you've seen specifically and recommendations and that type of thing. But on new acquisitions, one of the things that is always a challenge is that you have a newly acquired company that you're trying to integrate and capitalize on synergies, but you're also trying not to be too disruptive on that company and distort the value that was purchased. So you have to kind of balance that. Is that something that you've faced, or is that not in practicality, not really how it works out?
I think there's a big, misperception amongst a lot of the public who've not been in this. I can only speak from what I know, right? But I think the general public maybe thinks as private equity is this kind of really bad term, and they'll kind of come in and they'll ruin everything and they'll fire everybody, and they're against they're just disruptive. Definitely, there's far more careful consideration, right, about what's going to make a company successful. And all PE firms have a value thesis, right? And a value thesis, can be, hey, this company's carrying too much cost and needs to reduce cost because I can see what other companies are doing in the industry. At the other end of the spectrum, perhaps the growth thesis, right? Hey, this company I can totally see can be in new markets and has much more opportunity for growth with a bit more investment. A lot of activity happens as well where, PE firm is looking to use maybe their first acquisition as a platform to start bolting on other acquisitions as well. And their cost management and integration becomes an incredibly important topic, right? If you're adding all these companies together, you don't need 10 CEOs, obviously. You don't need a lot of other things as well.
Good feedback there. Okay. I just wanted to also talk a little bit about whether patterns and do you, on average, when you walk into a company, and maybe this is more companies that are under a financial constraint issue, or they've called you in because they just want to do better, have better performance. Is there a pattern to that? Is it a lot of common things that you see, or is every company very different?
No, I think there is some commonality actually, even amongst companies that think they're managing costs well. That there are always opportunities. That's one commonality. To get more specific, there's always a commonality. One of the levers you can apply to cost management or cost reduction is reduction in demand. By which I mean, do you have too many software licenses for a particular product, right? Because you've planned for a certain volume, but it kind of never happens. Have you bought things that you just simply don't use? And when I had a chance to reflect on this, so I've done a lot of kind of vendor related work, and in terms of savings, I mean, real savings you can put back on the P&L. Another commonality is the number always comes out to around between 8 and 12%. I say always, there's outliers at either end. When you add up all of the potential initiatives, everything that you could possibly do, there is an opportunity to kind of reduce that baseline by what ends up being a common amount. I don't know if it's just when you're looking at a portfolio, right? You some things are going to hit really well, some things are going to be a complete failure. Portfolio of initiatives, that is, but targeting 10% of your base, whatever's in the baseline for your vendor spend is pretty good. One other kind of commonality, since you asked the question, is any company that is using contingent labor. I found very few examples of where that is, really, really well managed. If they're using, even companies that are using an MSP to manage that kind of spend for them, there's always a lot extra that that you can kind of look at that isn't kind of within that space. I mean, it's always, when I say contingent labor, I mean contractors, temporary labor, individuals who are not employees of the company. But that is an area, I've always found that to be a fertile area for looking at, because it's everything from leaders who have favorite consultants, individual consultants even, that they have to keep on using, to companies that have been used for a long time and have never been sourced, to lack of competition when it comes to, to looking at, to individual contractors or even companies you're working with. So contingent labor is a pretty, a commonality, right, across companies where there's an opportunity for reduction in cost management.
And that's great, because now we're starting to dive a little deeper, which is great, because I think that's make this very useful to listeners. But let's stay on that contractor and consultants a little bit. So when you usually get involved with that and you start to make recommendations, is your recommendation usually just to cut the cord and say, look, you have this many contractors out there, we need to reduce that by X%, or just try to eliminate them entirely? What is usually your recommendation in the circumstance like that?
There's been an interesting evolution. It's like I call it like a pre-COVID and a post-COVID. Pre-COVID, the first time I came across this was in a previous company, when a colleague of mine looked at the baseline data, which was terrible to begin with, and said, okay, first thing we're going to do is we're going to go out and we're going to demand a 20% cost reduction, hourly cost reduction from every single person. No analysis, no RFPs or anything else. And I want to say that's like a common thing to do. And the spend often is so poorly managed, and you do have a lot of external labor, right, that has never been touched, right, for whatever reason. I mean, there's many reasons, but suddenly it's like, somebody's coming in here and they're making me have to think, suddenly it's going to be far less comfortable than it has been. And so that used to work. I mean, you could go in and say, look, we're cutting, and that's before, by the way, you start to apply other levers, such as, and by the way, we're also going to be RFPing your work, or we're going to be looking at whether this company even needs you to begin with. When I say post-COVID, I mean, I guess it's not really post-COVID, but when costs started to go up significantly in the last 4 or 5 years, I mean, everybody's cost is going up. So maybe a little bit more kind of cost increase mitigation versus cost reduction. I guess the whole point is it's not so easy just to go in and start demanding, a blanket 20% cost reduction. A little bit more thought and analysis is needed before you start to come up with your recommendations.
I think that's absolutely true. And I'm always shocked and frustrated, I should say, because when I go into organizations, many managers will treat their consultants and their contractors better than they do their own employees. They won't even blink an eye at a contractor who asks for a 10% pay increase when the rest of the company and their employees are getting on average 3% or less. And when I put out a policy, I have a blanket policy that says, look, we are only giving contractors a raise of 2% this year because we're only giving employees a raise of 2.5, and we're not going to give contractors better raises than we do our own employees. And that always gets, a lot of resistance. But as soon as you phrase it that way, that we're not treating contractors better than employees, it's really hard for people to try to push back on that. And then we do contractor freezes and other things to try to slowly diminish it. But I think if you have a mandate, you can come in and be much tougher than that and say, look, you have to justify every contractor that's here or they're gone. We're not leaving their knowledge, because their knowledge is now with them, which is outside the company, when you really want that knowledge and expertise within your employee base and try to groom the next leaders of your organization.
Yeah, actually, as you were saying that, you made me think of 2 or 3 things. So first of all, I'm not sure why you would offer them any raise at all. Let's just kind of start there. It's like, hey, good news for you. We can either RFP your work for you and look for somebody else, or do you want to keep going? Look at some point, maybe there's a justification for it. But so I'm not sure that I would even be that generous.
Love it.
The second thing is that there was one particular client that I do remember from my past, and they were a consolidation of a lot of different companies, and they'd been through their own kind of cost reduction program. They had eliminated a lot of people. As a software product company, they had eliminated a lot of good talent, right, that they thought was no longer needed. This happens many times more than once at this company. But a group of those people who got fired kind of banded together, created their own company, and ended up selling their services back to the same company that had just fired them. This is a product company, by the way. This is a true story. And company suddenly was paying, I think in one case, on a per person, per individual basis, 5x what they'd been paying them as employees before.
Crazy.
Which is insane. And this was not just one individual pocket. This happened several times as they company made bad decisions. And there were individuals who were kind of selling this back. And, the other thing as well is employees are normally paid like a fixed salary, right, plus a bonus per year. So you kind of know what your cost is going to be. And then there was one individual, that I came across in the data. Listen, if you're a contractor, I should say, and you can get, paid on an hourly basis. I remember looking through the data and seeing this individual who had been an employee like 5 or 6 years before. His compensation for the year was kind of, heading towards 6 figures. Sorry, 7 figures. It was heading towards 7 figures, pretty well. And, I think he'd booked like 3,500 hours, right, for whatever work he'd been doing. I do want to say, again, contract labor, there's definitely, you talked about commonalities, often an opportunity there for better cost management and reduction.
Yeah. I remember a lot of times they would come to me and want rate increases. And I would say that really their reward for doing good work for my company was not an increase in rate. It was more work, so that, they would have greater opportunity. They could expand the pie by getting more opportunities because they're doing good work, but it's not going to be a rate increase. And I also see a lot of times where employees that leave the company, back to what you're saying, not necessarily as organized as the example that you gave, but they get hired back at rates that were hired. And I just had a policy that no one could be hired back as consultant for a year after they left the company. That was a blanket requirement.
That's actually really common, right? The companies look, because labor is, employee labor is an easy thing to cut, in the sense that the numbers show up immediately, and then putting that policy. I've seen this so many times. The policy of, we are going to put a freeze on hiring. We're going to eliminate everything that's in the budget. Of people who've not hired already, and then they kind of end up kind of getting stuck with the only way to get somebody in to do a task is getting them in as a contractor, temporary labor, or whatever that is. And that isn't necessarily the best answer for that company.
Yeah, and because other employees see that, and now they all want to do that, or they get resentful that they know the other person's coming back and making more money than they did when they were with the company. So it's just bad for morale. It's just bad all around.
Yeah.
To move on from the contractor aspect, you also mentioned another one earlier, just in passing, about which I refer to as utilization, where you realize that a lot whether it's, and I go even more broad. I think you were referring to like software that had a lot of licenses that were on the shelf that they had thought that they were going to grow into, or they just got a better rate because they got more licenses and they didn't end up needing them or using them. Is utilization what, as I refer to it, as a major finding in a lot of companies that you work with?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I always go to look for straight away, right? I mean, it is not uncommon, to find the company is paying for a software module that they're just not using, or, they were convinced to use it. And I'll give an example, right? So a company I worked for where they were paying for a learning platform, a learning module from another company. At the same time, they were using Oracle and had a big license for lots of different things, and included in there, right, included in what they're already paying was exactly the same functionality. In the view of this company, they kind of wanted to be best of breed, right? So, whatever this other module was, or whatever this other platform was deemed at the time, this was, they procured it a few years before, to be better than whatever the Oracle equivalent was at the time. But can you really justify paying for that extra thing when honestly, maybe the Oracle module, maybe it was 95% as good as this other, external module, but is it really that much worthwhile? The second one, I know this kind of fits into the utilization part, but it's one thing that I go to look for as well, is depending on the nature of the company. I don't know if we covered this earlier. My kind of background, functionally speaking, if it's not already obvious, is more around kind of technology and IT. So a lot of my examples kind of refer to that. But, paying for platinum level support for something when, what you really need is the tin level support. Because, hey, guess what? In the last year, I don't have any evidence of ever having needed to use that. I don't need 4-hour response. Actually, 4-week response is fine. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but looking for things that you just simply don't need or have never needed.
Yeah, yeah. And I think my utilization aspect of it goes even beyond software and technology. It's into office space. I would even argue it's into employees that aren't being properly utilized in that aspect of it. But I agree with you on the technology side. I see a lot of poor utilization. And then I also see a fair amount of overlap. And you talked about that one example with kind of the learning applications. But I find most of the time when I find overlap, or I find it through acquisition. What happened is that they acquired a company and oddly many times several companies over time, and each of them had an application that was similar to the parent company, but it was so well integrated into the acquired company that they were very hesitant to try to uproot it, or it was going to be very expensive to configure it to the existing application. And what the easy answer became is that, okay, we'll just let both applications run for a period of time. And before you know it, they've done another acquisition and there's a third application. And sometimes it's even the same application, but they're configured so differently. They keep the same, two different contract. I find a lot of overlap in that way. Do you find through acquisition that it creates a lot of redundancies in product and services, and particularly that technology side?
Of course, absolutely. And often, IT technology is the space where that becomes most prevalent. But I do think there's an important kind of, clarification there. It kind of goes back to my thoughts around, kind of private actually not making dumb decisions. I mean, it's easy to say, we've got, we've got two applications or systems that do exactly the same thing. Of course, we should eliminate one and do the other one. But can you really justify that, right? I mean, financially, does it actually make sense? Of course, from an IT person's point of view, of course it makes sense, right? But from a business point of view, does it really make sense? I do recall there's one client that's a kind of aggregation of 4 separate companies, 3 of roughly the same size, one of a much smaller size. Each one, when I was there, had their own ERP system. And certainly, bringing the ERP systems into one was part of their plan. And it really did make a lot of sense, and it was expensive. But one of the companies had a BPO outsourcing contract with a very large and very well, name brand company. The contract was kind of completely intertwined into the business. They would have spent more money simply trying to figure out how to, disintertwine. So bringing three companies together. By the way, we're talking about marketing, finance, this is not just technology. This is the operations of the company. I mean, in fact, it was all back office operations of the company. So, one of the things you said, well, actually, should we be going the other way? Should we be looking at moving everything that's in these three other companies into this existing, kind of outsourcing contract field? The answer ended up being actually it kind of made sense to bring some of it in-house, specifically the marketing work, right, that was being done by this company. And so this outsourcing company was doing the marketing, was the marketing arm for this company that had been acquired. That made sense to kind of bring in. But other areas just simply didn't make sense financially to kind of bring in, or at least, if it would be done, it would be done over many more years, and maybe, taking off a little chunk at a time.
That makes a lot of sense. And one more deeper area I want to dive into before we pull back for a minute is human capital. And one of the things that whenever an AlixPartners or someone like you or I have called in, people immediately anticipate layoffs. And in fairness, a lot of times that is the end solution or I say a component of the solution is to reduce headcount. Do you find that the companies are generally overstaffed? Do you think they're not being well utilized? There's too much redundancy. What is the reason that you see these headcounts often follow companies that come in and want to help the company do better profitability wise? How are they structured that ends up resulting in reductions in headcount?
Yeah, look, I mean, I want to say every single company, right? This is the most sensitive topic, right? And every company that's in business, every company that I've worked with has aspirations for kind of, growth and for things getting better. Let me make it even simpler than that. So everybody is and should be planning ahead for, happier days. And so some is quite simple that I don't want to use the term overhiring because that's a bit too simplistic, but, suddenly things have taken a little bit of a turn, and, the need to have as many people in every area of the company, it just isn't there anymore. Often when any consultant is brought into a company, often I'd say the reaction isn't, oh, great, that means we must be growing, right? It doesn't matter who the consulting company is. Consultants are brought in because, somebody knows that something's going to happen. AlixPartners, like other consulting companies, are helping out with strategy and growth as well, right? But let's kind of put that to one side. Usually when consultants show up, it isn't, again, employees aren't thinking, oh, great, this signals better times for everybody. And sometimes, companies, they want that independent view, right? The answer may be obvious. Hey, our accounts payable department simply isn't processing as many invoices as we thought it would do, or as it was doing a year ago, or, it isn't up to the benchmarks that we expect. And, but we want somebody to come in and kind of give us the independent view on, do we have too many people in that area? There's some other kind of more, touchy areas. Here's an interesting one, which is, around Salesforce productivity, right? Slightly interesting divergence right here, but I'll get to the point. A friend of mine who's with an AI company where they took in all of the sales calls for a month, and they kind of analyzed them all. And what the conclusion they came to was the person that the company thought was the best salesperson actually was the one who was actually costing them business, and was actually causing a lot of this is based on the interactions that were happening on the phone, what came out of it versus what should have come out of it, and so on. And so, the company ended up kind of releasing the person that everybody had assumed was the best salesperson because he had the best numbers, but those numbers should have been significantly higher, and he was causing the company issues in other areas. But, but Salesforce productivity is something where having somebody do an independent, review of the data, understanding, are the top salespeople, really the ones who are, I think, top? I mean, the 80-20 rule, right? If 20% of the salespeople are producing all of my sales, is that really true, right? Challenging assumptions. And I think that's one thing that consultants can be good at is, if you're in a company, right, and you've been there day to day for months or years, it's been ticking along, having somebody come in and simply bring the fresh viewpoint and challenging the long held assumptions about how things should be can be helpful as well.
One other aspect, I have an opinion on this, but I want yours, is that when you see all these companies announcing layoffs and your experience when you've worked with companies that have done reductions in force, a lot of them attribute it to AI and that they're just becoming more efficient with AI. Is that a convenient excuse in the sense where most of those employees just not well utilized and probably there was efficiencies to be had before AI even came into play? Or is that really valid that AI is the one that is causing a lot of the reductions in force that you see announced occasionally?
Yeah. I mean, look, personally, I think right now, today, I think it's a convenient excuse. Technology organization that I was working with about a year ago, and we were talking about how they were using AI, and all of our developers now use Copilot, and so we don't need as much testing, as much effort to do QA and testing. You kind of dig a little bit deeper, and everybody does have a Copilot license, that's true, but I mean, come on, it's not really how you're using it. So look, I believe, maybe 2 or 3 years from now, that will be the reason for sure.
Right.
I do think you're right, though. I think there is a certain level of, this is a convenient excuse right now as to reduce my head count.
Makes sense now. So I'm going to pull back for just a minute and just ask some more higher level questions. When you leave a company, one of the things that I found discouraging was that many times they would implement a lot of the suggestions that were made. They would be realizing the benefit of those suggestions. I would argue operating more efficiently, becoming more profitable, and I would even say growing more rapidly because they're leaner and leaner organizations grow. But I've been called back in 1 or 2 circumstances to the same company years later, and I was shocked about how they reverted back to the way they were before I had come originally. And do you feel that it sticks with companies, or do you feel that companies need people like us to come in periodically just to do a fresh reminder and scrub? Or is there a way that those lessons can stick?
Truthfully, I want to say 100% of the time in my consulting career, when you kind of, finish a project and you leave, there are other reasons why projects finish. But when you finish a project and leave, you always try to leave behind not just, whatever results or whatever number you help the company with, but the tools, the processes, the ways of working to help those people do better in the future always. So half of me says they ought not to use, right? They ought not to need help going forward, right? They should have enough, be given enough to to kind of continue those good practices. But some of this is human nature, right? So first of all, as a consultant, you are adding more kind of horsepower, more human bodies into the mix, right? So of course, more work can actually get done, which is obvious. And some of it is, there is a now you've brought sort of like a decay effect, right? So you establish some good practice. I mean, for example, if you're doing a procurement project, I know the topic is broader. If you're doing a procurement project, but do you have a target, right? And you're maintaining that target, and are you showing how you're tracking towards that target? I mean, that could not be more simple, right? To in my view, to do that. This is before we talk about any other best practices. So, I'm starting off a new year. My target for, procurement cost reduction is $1 million, and I want to demonstrate at the end of the year that I've done that. Are you even doing that? And look, here's the thing, right? First of all, if nobody's asking, hey, Dwayne, how are you going against that target you laid out? If you're not being asked or challenged for that, then probably you're not going to be focusing on it in a major way. So I guess the point really is, I think the practices do, kind of decay over time. I think there is, if you're not holding people accountable, especially on the cost side, right? Cost is something you can hold people accountable for. Everybody has budgets. People are kind of, held to their budgets, but are they held to, and I need you to, take out 5% from your budget ahead of next year? I mean, often people are not held to account there as well. Dwayne, I'm going to just, if you don't mind, you and I, as you said, work together. An interesting slip of the tongue when you said kind of, worked for him and then with him. There's a interesting dynamic there, right, with consultants. But I think I was definitely working for you. But a couple of things I observed, right, working for you directly is, and I've just never, I've not seen this anywhere else. First of all, the company where you and I worked together, you were using Cooper. And you set up Cooper in a way that I just never seen before. And it was just, it was just awesome for the procurement team, right? I mean, it was structured in such a way that it was so easy to understand categories and spend. I personally hadn't seen anyone else, any other organization do that, right? The other thing, which absolutely to me seems very easy, but I get why it kind of doesn't happen, is that you were getting your savings numbers validated by somebody in finance as well. As a consultant, one of the things I do, right, when I go into a company for a cost reduction project is I try to, make a good connection with somebody in finance. There's usually a finance business partner, right? As a consultant, you've got to kind of demonstrate that you've delivered the savings. So making sure that person can verify you've saved what you said you can save is important, to be paid as a contractor. But as an employee, to do what you did, set that up and have somebody verifying and validating the savings, I thought was awesome. And that is absolutely a best practice. I've never seen it anywhere else. When life got a bit more tricky, should we say, that was just a task I think that the finance department, or was it the auditing department, simply didn't have the time or the resources to do themselves.
Well, Jim, I have to say first to let the listeners and audience know that I didn't pay you for that one. But I will also say that you could take, when I market these things, I always take a little clip, and you can be sure that that's going to be one of the clips I take. But thank you very much from that. And I do feel like that's very important, that there's two aspects of that is that I think it's very important that you make any system that you put in easy to use and clear, because that makes it more likely it will be used and leaned on and useful. So the user interface is very important up front, and to have information that you could also distribute clearly afterwards makes it critical to the success.
Yeah, and if I add one thing to that, I think a lot of first of all, everybody knows it's not about the system, it's about the data, right? But I think most systems are probably set up to enable the financial reporting to happen, or to satisfy by the needs of the financial team, not set up usually to, which it could be, right, to also satisfy the needs of a well-functioning kind of procurement or cost management organization, right? In order to do that, you don't have to have that Cooper set up the way you set up, but oh my God, it made it 1,000 times easier and cleaner to do the analysis you needed to do.
Good. And then as far as the savings, I think that's just an aspect of accountability. And that brings me really into is a bigger picture issue that I've always had. It's a harder issue to solve within a company, but critical is that, because we've talked about the consulting ends and how do you handle consultants and utilization and even human capital and that type of thing. But one of the things that I've noticed with companies that is much more difficult and challenging is that some of their issues are structural. Like, for example, I've run into management teams that, because the CEO was a visionary, which is very common, loved to hire other visionaries. And so you just had a whole C-suite of people that were kind of visionaries and not, that weren't able to execute on things. With I've had also situations where management was very easily distracted. They were on chasing just a million things and really was not focused on the core aspect of the business. I've had companies that were cost awareness as a culture was very low. And so employees weren't being taught that the money was real and that they should spend money like their own. Although I would joke that you got to be careful with that, because a lot of them don't spend money well on their own either. But so there's a lot of things that are kind of, I don't know if it's personality of the company, if I would word it that way, that are very important, including accountability, where companies' management styles not to hold employees accountable. And all those different traits end up really hurting a company. Do you address those type of things when you go in, as far as beyond just, hey, here's specific cost savings, here's a structure or philosophy or approach that is not working for you as a company?
So I'm going to speak about my own personal experience, and I'll answer it in a simple way, which is no. Okay. Don't really get involved in that. But I recall from my own kind of business books, companies often oscillate between a growth visionary CEO and a operationally focused CEO as they over time. Look, first of all, I'm sure there are companies that do that, but to me, cost management and having a cost focus doesn't sound like it should be as hard as it seems to be. It doesn't matter whether you're a visionary or a highly operational focused person, but if maybe it's we'll let this cost go, and then we'll let that cost go, and suddenly before you know it, there's a lot of costs which you didn't really need to spend to begin with. I mean, I tried a consulting cliche at the beginning of this, fuel for growth. My God, how much of that money could be spent on something truly that could make a difference in the company? And if you're a visionary, go hire a really strong operator, right, who is going to make sure that that these things do happen, that there is a focus on it, that you are not that you are tracking not just at a budget level and a quarterly report out level, but okay, I want to know exactly what everybody is doing to reduce their costs every month, every quarter. I want to go use that money to go invest in new plants, right? Invest in a new product, to go hire somebody that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to hire. It does, I guess, now the way you brought up the question, this topic feels like it's harder than it ought to be for companies to address.
Yes. It is. It's math in many cases. It's that's the beauty of what I like about our field, is that I like to think of it as truth. And if it's done right, it actually does not have to be done painful. The reason it becomes painful is because people are so poor at it.
Yeah, actually, Dwayne, I got to chime in on something there. So the reason that I like this field as well, actually, I think exactly the same reason. I like being able to see something happen, right? No, so you can see the results. If you're at the involved in the other end of the company, the growth strategy, certainly you can see that. But sometimes it can be harder to see, exactly where, exactly where something had an impact. A bit like to the example I gave of, a real situation where it was considered, the guy who was considered to be the lead salesperson actually turned out to be, not the lead salesperson. Maybe it was math at the end of the day, but in some respects, I do like the simplicity. But being able to see the result of kind of what we do is good. I like that.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very rewarding aspect when you see that a company not only survive but thrive, and it's a very rewarding experience. I agree. The last topic I want to hit is and we're all in the prediction business, I guess. Because we do contracts that are multiple years. We're trying to decide what is best for a company in the long term. But we are at a time of kind of unprecedented change. And from a cost management standpoint, what do you see on the horizon in the next, even just 3 to 5 years, whether that because of AI and technology? How can companies prepare for that? And what are you advising companies on that longer term aspect?
Right. So, obviously, I'd be owning my own private island if I was any good at that at all. I think the last, few months, really getting into the the different AI technologies, and they have I just been absolutely astounded by what I've personally been able to do. Look, just as a very just kind of simple example, I was on a project. I was using one of the AI tools for the very first time, and I didn't really know anything about it, and I had a spreadsheet of 2,500 vendors. And I've been asked the question, hey, we think we need to reduce IT costs. I simply uploaded the spreadsheets to one of these tools and say, can you identify for me in here who are all of the IT vendors? Mm-hmm. First of all, it did in 5 minutes. What would have taken me a day or so. Look, there are names that are obvious and stuff you don't need AI to tell you. But there are a whole bunch of companies. I want to say around 10 companies. I had no idea that they were IT related. I would have not have known looking, based on the name, because often you can just tell by a company's name, right? Would not known by the name or the data that I was given. It did not appear in their financials or the P&L. Right? It was shadow IT spend, and I was just absolutely flabbergasted. And then you see, that sounds like an easy task, but you see some of the tasks that can be done today, and it is truly outstanding. So yes, I mean, I would have to believe any white collar work, any kind of knowledge work in the next 5 to 10 years is absolutely under threat from what the AI technologies are not. The thing is that they are improving at an incredible rate as well.
Yeah.
And just one other thing I've learned as well is the way what makes these things even more powerful is being able to, for example, take something that say ChatGPT generated and feed it into Claude and say, hey, what do you think about this? I mean, these big the things we're all hearing about in the news, as they start as you start to get the the incremental power, not incremental, the multiplying power of all of these coming together. Hey, you know what? Incredible is what I think. And white collar work, if you're entering the workforce to do white collar work, just give some thought as to, is AI something that really could do what I'm doing? If not today, maybe 6 months from now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think and also learn how to partner with AI, right? In the sense that, because if you are just a resistor, if you will, of AI, or just waiting for it to come and see if it takes your job, I think that's probably not an effective strategy.
Well, here's the thing, right? Something I do passionately believe: if you're doing not knowledge related work at the moment, where AI could potentially be a factor in reducing that, I can almost guarantee you that there are companies thinking right now today how to eliminate your job, not just help you do your job better, but eliminate your job using AI.
Yeah, interesting. But that is great feedback. I think I've kept you for almost an hour here, so this has been very helpful, and I think the audience can get some great insight from your experience, because there's very few people I know that have had your extensive experience in this. So, Jim, I want to thank you for sharing that with the audience here, and this has been very helpful.
Dwayne, thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone.